Hello, welcome back to our Bible study on the Apostle Paul. I'm Guy Williams, First United Methodist Church in Dayton, Texas. It is our mission as a church to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus. And so I hope that the Bible study that we're doing of the life and ministry and writings of Paul can help us all to do that as we learn about Paul's journey, that we can identify with some of his experiences, that we can learn from what he does and grow in our discipleship and following Jesus as well. So let's begin. We're looking at Paul's second missionary journey this week. And this is following the Jerusalem Council, where they made a big decision about the inclusion of Gentiles and how that works exactly. And it works through faith in Jesus, just like it does for the Jewish Christians or Jewish believers in Jesus. They don't have to become Jews first and take on the covenant of Moses in circumcision or in observance of the Torah, but they come to be a part of the family of God, the people of God, directly through belief and faith in Jesus as God's Messiah, as the Christ. So they wrote a letter to the leaders in the Jerusalem church, wrote a letter to be sent out, and they selected a number of people to do that. At the end of chapter 15 is where we find that Paul and Barnabas have a disagreement as they prepare to do so, as they prepare to take the letter out to the churches. And it simply says sometime later. So we don't really know exactly, but sometime later, Paul says to Barnabas, let's go back and visit some of the towns where we preach the word and see how they're doing. So he wants to go check in. Barnabas wants to take John, it says, who's also called Mark or John Mark. Well, John Mark is the person who is attributed to the gospel according to Mark. That's who wrote that gospel. That gospel is widely understood to be the first gospel that was written around the year, between the years AD 60 and 65. For reference, the years that we're talking about in this study today are from around the year 49 to 52, so about 2.5 to 3 years length of time here. So they do not, Paul was disappointed with John Mark for deserting them in their previous journey, and he had not continued with them in their work, so Paul has strong feelings about this. They have a very sharp disagreement, and Barnabas parts ways. He takes Paul, they sail, and they go on a trip, on a missionary journey as well. But Paul chooses Silas, who is one of the leaders in the Jerusalem church, who was selected to help take the letter that James wrote out to the churches. So Paul and Silas now are traveling together, and Luke is documenting from here out. He'll touch on other people, but he is following Paul all the way through. In fact, he will get to a part of the letter, the book of Acts, where the narration is not in the third person talking about others, it's in the first person plural. He uses we as in indicating that he is with them in the journey, and so Luke is firsthand in a lot of the second half of this book. So in chapter 16, we begin the journeys. At the very beginning of chapter 16, we meet someone who we are aware of from other parts of the Bible. We meet Timothy. Timothy is the person who is addressed by Paul in the first and second letter of Timothy, as he's kind of advising him on his work as a pastor. So they find him there. His mother is Jewish, his father is Greek. He is a believer, Timothy, and his mother, that is. And so the believers there in Lystra and Iconium, where they meet, speak well of him. So Paul wants to take him along to the journey. He has him circumcised, which initially seems like a very odd thing to do, because he just went and argued in Jerusalem about how they shouldn't need to circumcise anyone. Well, it turns out that because everyone knows that his father is a Greek, he's not circumcising Timothy so that he can become a part of the people of God. He's circumcising Timothy so that they are able to have full and free and non-controversial access to the Jewish synagogues, to the Jews who are not yet believers in Jesus, so that they might evangelize them, which shows that Paul is not against an action in and of itself in this case. He is opposed to it based on what the motivation is. If there's an evangelistic opportunity, Paul is good to go. If we're saying this is something required to be part of the people of God and to be in right standing with God, he's saying, no way, don't do it, because all you need is Jesus. So, having done this, Paul and Silas and Timothy travel around some, but they're kind of thwarted. They don't find the right place to go until they receive a vision from a man from Macedonia, from a different region, reaching out to them and asking them to come and to preach the word. So that's what gives guidance to their mission from there on out. Now, I love these few chapters because we meet some of the places that we recognize based on the fact that there are also letters from Paul to these locations. And so in a way, as I read about these, it helps me to picture these people in the congregation when the letter that Paul writes later that's addressed to their church is read. So we get to Philippi. So the letter to the Philippians is written to the people in Philippi. And we meet two people in particular. One is Lydia. We meet her in verse 11 through 15. She is a businesswoman. She deals in purple cloth. That is the color of royalty. And so she is built good wealth. She's over her household, which means she's perhaps a widow, but it also means that she is a significant person in her community. So she has wealth from her business. She operates her business. She's over her household, and she has the wherewithal to offer hospitality and let people stay in her home, these traveling missionaries. So she insists that Paul and Silas and Timothy stay in her home while they are in Philippi. So she's a significant benefactor in her generosity and leader in that Philippian church. So they stay there. They're going to a place of prayer in verse 16, and they run into an issue with a slave girl who has a spirit that allows her to prophesy. Her owners make a lot of money off of this by her fortune telling. And when Paul casts this spirit out, Luke says, because he's so annoyed about it, that the spirit leaves her, and the owners recognize that their hope of making money with her is now gone. And so they are angry. But this is interesting to me. In verse 20, it says, they brought them before the magistrates. That is, the owners brought Paul and his companions before the magistrates and said, these men are Jews, and they are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. Now that might have been true, but the real reason that they were objecting is because they were losing money. So it seems to me that basically greed can make us dishonest. We come up with all sorts of rationales about why something is wrong when our pocketbook is affected, even if we won't admit that it's simply that our pocketbook is affected. So Paul and Silas end up in prison. There is an earthquake, shakes the foundations, their chains fall off. This is a famous passage. Before all that happens, it appears to me that we have a great example of something Paul wrote being practiced in real time. So it says in verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Well, in Philippians 4, verse 4, he says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Well, Paul knew what he was talking about. And perhaps the folks in Philippi remembered this instance in particular and thought when they read, rejoice in the Lord always. Well, Paul knows what that means. He's not just saying something that sounds nice. He really knows about this when the rubber meets the road. So the jailer wakes up. Paul and them shout, don't harm yourself, we're all here. He's in charge of this group and he's about to kill himself. Otherwise, he would have been tortured and killed for a punishment. Jailer calls for the lights. They rush in. He cries out to them, sirs, what must I do to be saved? In verse 30. Now, N.T. Wright, one of the top scholars of our age, points out, excuse me, that the word saved here is used in the New Testament in a variety of ways. One is saved as in reconciled in relationship to God. Another way is healed in the Gospels, that those two words are kind of the same Greek word is interchangeable for those two English meanings. And rescued. So here, he very well could be saying something like, what must I do to be rescued, to get out of this mess, to get out of this terrible conundrum I find myself in? So there's sort of a double meaning perhaps, but Paul is able to take this cry to recognize that pleading for rescue and how to get out of this mess, and he speaks to it, but he speaks to a deeper relational, spiritual need that the jailer has to believe in the Lord Jesus, and you'll be rescued, you'll be saved. So they speak the word to him. He and his whole household are baptized, just as Lydia and her entire household were baptized upon her belief in Jesus. And so they end up moving on. You can read the rest of the chapter to kind of see how that happens there. But they move on from Philippi, and they go to several more places. Chapter 17, they go to Thessalonica. That is the place where we reference the letters of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. In fact, during this period of this journey is when we date the letters to the 1st and 2nd letters to the Thessalonian church. So the letters that are written, first is Galatians, that's before the Jerusalem Council probably. And then after that are 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, written during this period of AD 49 to 52. After Thessalonica, they go to Berea. Berea, this is a great passage to read through and to really take note of, because in verse 11 it says, "Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, so the reason why is they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. And as a result, many of them believed, as well as did a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men." So they're reaching Jews and Greeks in their preaching in Berea. And the Berean Christians or the Berean Jews who become followers of Jesus, they are really a great example because they listen to what Paul says. They're eager to hear it, but they also go back, they search the scriptures, they do the Bible study for themselves, and they square up what Paul is saying. This is a great thing that just about every pastor or Bible teacher hopes for their congregation to be like the Bereans, who will listen and be interested and be eager to hear and to learn, but who also go back, they read it for themselves, they absorb it, and they check to see, is what the pastor's saying, is that true? I want to check that out in the scripture for myself as well. So they're a great example for us. And then at the end of this section, in verse 14, 15, we find that Silas and Timothy stay at Berea, but Paul goes on to Athens. And so he's traveling alone, it seems. He gets to Athens, and there's a great, one of Paul's great speeches is in this section where he stands up in the Areopagus and speaks to the people. And basically he calls them out for their idolatry. And he takes an inscription of an altar that says, "To an unknown God." And he uses that to say that you were ignorant of who you were even trying to worship. And he preaches to them about the God who revealed himself to the Jewish people, and tells them that they need to turn away from their idolatry and their carved images or graven images and turn to God. Some hear about the resurrection of the dead and sneer and think it's ridiculous. Others are interested and want to hear some more, so they follow up with him, and some people become followers. Luke is saying, as we've seen otherwise, when Paul is beaten up and gets away from a place with his life, that the reaction is mixed. Many places it will say a great many people turn to the Lord, but that shouldn't keep us from remembering that sometimes Paul had people respond to the gospel positively, and sometimes he had them respond negatively or even violently. At the end of chapter 17, he moves on to, he leaves Corinth in chapter 18 rather. he leaves Athens, and in chapter 18, he goes to Corinth. So it's a second place, or actually a third place now, where we've got a letter or letters in the New Testament associated with places that we see Paul visiting on this second missionary journey. Philippi, Thessalonica, and Corinth are all included here. So Paul leaves, he meets, there's a couple of things that happen here that I want to highlight. Read chapter 18 for yourself, of course, but I want to highlight that one is he meets up with a Jew named Aquila, that's the husband, and his wife Priscilla. And they become good friends. They're all tent makers, so they've got the same trade, and so they connect on a number of levels, and they are leaders in that area. Also, Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia, and Paul meets up with them again. So Paul is now not alone anymore. He's surrounded by friends. He's got his co-workers and his friends back together with him. They have good success. The leader of the synagogue and his entire household came to faith in Jesus, and so that's encouraging. He also gets a vision in verse 9 through 10, where the Lord comes to him and speaks to him and says, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Don't be silent. I'm with you. No one is going to attack or harm you," which would be good news for Paul at this point, because I have many people in this city. So it says in verse 11, Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of the Lord. So he has an extended ministry there in Corinth. And the last one I want to mention is down in verse 18 and following, that Paul stayed in Corinth for some time. So we have at least a year and a half, but maybe sometime, maybe longer, we're not sure. But he's got Priscilla and Aquila, who are his friends, this married couple, but also he meets Apollos, who is from Alexandria, and he comes to Ephesus. He's a learned man, verse 24, with thorough knowledge of the scriptures, and he had been instructed in the way of the Lord. And so Priscilla and Aquila hear him, verse 26, and they invite him to their home, and they kind of take him under their wing. And so now Paul has met these folks, but he's got, the work is continuing not only through himself, but also through Priscilla and Aquila mentoring Apollos to help with the work also. So at this point, Paul returns back to Jerusalem and concludes his second missionary journey. And so we'll conclude there as well. He'll have another one before he leaves Jerusalem for the last time, and but we'll take that up in a future kind of session. So the reflection guide is attached to this description in YouTube or in the post in Facebook. I invite you to pull that up and either contribute to the discussion in our Facebook Bible study group, or pull it up or print it off, read the questions, reflect on them yourself. Going back and looking at these episodes of Paul, it's been really great to see how things that happen to him really connect with my walk as well. So I hope they will do the same for you. Thanks. I'll see you next time.